Before the headline, before the arrest, before the body. Cycles that kill. If you have Netflix, you probably already know what today's episode is about. The documentary Maternal Instincts dropped today, and I know a lot of you are going to watch it, or you already have, and you're going to come away with the same question everyone always comes away with after a case like this one. Why? Why would a woman fake a pregnancy for 10 months? Why would she construct an entire false identity, fake wealth, fake medical conditions, fake ultrasounds, fake gender reveal parties to keep a man? Why would she drive to her friend's house, attack her, and murder her? Why would she commit fetal abduction? Why? The documentary will give you the timeline, the evidence, the courtroom, and I'm not here to compete with that. I'm here to fully answer the why, clinically, with the framework that most true crime coverage never goes near. Welcome to Cycles That Kill. I'm Dr. Dylesia, licensed clinical social worker, doctor of social work, and the clinician who coined the term mother-daughter trauma. Today, we're going to trace Taylor Parker's behavior back to where it actually started. Not in October 2020, not in 2019 when she met Wade Griffin, not even in 2015 when she had a hysterectomy and lost the ability to carry a child. It started long before any of that. In a home, with a mother, with a divorce, with a father who took his children to drug houses, with a little girl who learned, before she was old enough to articulate it, that her real self was not enough to make anyone stay. That is the cycle that killed Reagan Simmons-Hancock and her unborn daughter, Braxlynn Sage. Let's talk about it. Before we get into Taylor, we have to say Reagan Simmons-Hancock's name. She was 21 years old and a young mother with a 3-year-old daughter named Kingsley, who was in the house the morning her mother was killed. Reagan was almost 8 months pregnant with her second child, a daughter she and her husband Homer had named Braxlynn Sage. Reagan knew Taylor Parker. They weren't strangers. Taylor had positioned herself as someone in Reagan's life, someone Reagan had reason to trust enough to open her door on a Friday morning in October 2020. Taylor Parker was born in East Texas. Her parents, Shauna Pryor and Mark Morton, divorced in 2005 when Taylor was 12 years old. The split was not clean, as a lot of splits are, and they tried shared custody by having the children stay in the house while the parents alternated weeks. But Mark did not handle the divorce well. He refused to leave and caused fights in front of the children. Taylor eventually drifted toward living primarily with him, while her younger brother Zachary stayed more with their mother. Zach later testified that their father took them to what he now recognizes as drug houses when he was a child. Taylor's relationship with her mother, Shauna, was volatile from early on. A former friend actually testified that every time she witnessed Taylor and Shauna interact, they were hollering at each other, that Shauna would degrade her daughter publicly, and that she could not imagine having that kind of relationship with her own mother. A defense social worker testified during sentencing that Taylor suffered trauma in her childhood and key developmental phases that contributed to her actions. Now, I want to pause here before we go further, because this is where most true crime coverage stops. Bad childhood, unstable parents, and then we skip ahead to the crime. That's not what we're going to do. I want to show you exactly how what happened in that house became what happened on October 9th, 2020, step by step, clinically, so that you can see the cycle and not just the outcome. By adolescence, the pattern was already forming. At 17, Taylor became pregnant, the relationship didn't last, and she eventually married a man named Tommy Wakasi. They had 2 children together. Following those births, Taylor had a tubal ligation in 2014 and a medically necessary hysterectomy in 2015. Tommy testified she was extremely upset about the procedures. She then married a second man, Hunter Parker, without telling him she was infertile until after the wedding. Hunter testified that during their marriage, she faked seizures to keep their relationship together. Pause. That's right, she faked seizures to keep a man from leaving. This is not a woman who snapped one day in October 2020. This is a woman with a documented years-long pattern of fabrication. Sources say prior to the incident, she told coworkers she had cancer, had a sister who died, had MS, a stroke, and even after she was arrested in prison, she manipulated a mentally ill inmate to testify that she didn't murder Reagan, rather a local gang set her up. 2 forensic psychologists and a psychiatrist who evaluated her at trial described her as a pathological liar with features of multiple personality disorders. Taylor's history of fabrication predates the hysterectomy. It predates Wade Griffin. It likely predates her adult relationships entirely. And that is the clinical question this episode exists to answer. Where does a pattern like that come from? What does a child have to learn and from whom to grow into an adult whose primary relational tool is inventing false information to deceive others? I want to introduce you to several clinical concepts in this segment because Taylor Parker's case presents a rich clinical picture and I want you to have the language to see it clearly. The first is borderline personality disorder, also known as BPD. The forensic psychologist who reviewed the full case record at trial testified that Taylor's behavior was consistent with cluster B personality disorders, specifically borderline features. Borderline personality disorder is a deeply rooted disorder of self and relationship that commonly originates in chronic emotional invalidation during childhood. The DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual clinicians use, identifies 9 criteria for BPD. The ones most relevant to Taylor's documented behavior are a markedly unstable sense of self or identity, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, impulsivity, and chronic feelings of emptiness. The second concept is identity disturbance. This is one of the core features of BPD, and it is the clinical spine of this episode. Identity disturbance means a persistently unstable self-image, which is not the same as being confused about who you are. It means your identity is not anchored. It shifts, it morphs, it reorganizes itself around whoever is in the room and what that person needs you to be. Because without the relationship and the external mirror it provides, you have no stable selfhood. The third concept is emotional dysregulation, also a core BPD feature. Emotional dysregulation is what happens when the internal system for managing emotional responses has not developed in a way that matches the size of what is actually happening. The emotional response fires too intensely, too quickly, and in directions that the rational mind cannot fully moderate. In Taylor's case, that would be faking seizures in response to a fracturing marriage or escalating schemes as a pregnancy lie approaches its expiration date. Those are all emotional dysregulation driving behavior that rational cognition alone would have stopped long before it reached a crime scene. The fourth concept is compulsive deception as a relational tool. As I said before, expert witnesses at trial used the term pathological liar to describe Taylor. Unlike pathological lying, ordinary lying is strategic. Now, it doesn't make it right, but when someone tells an ordinary lie, they tell it to get something specific. Compulsive deception in the context of identity disturbance is different. It has a survival orientation. So people who pathologically lie and compulsively deceive others lie because telling the truth, presenting the real version of themselves, feels like annihilation. They've been taught that the real version of themselves is not enough, so they construct a version that is, and they maintain that construction at whatever cost. The fifth concept is maladaptive identity performance. This is where I want you to see something that goes beyond Taylor, because maladaptive identity performance is what happens when a person has learned through a childhood of not being seen clearly to construct entirely different versions of themselves for every relationship that they're in. The wealthy heiress who could buy a $4.5 million walnut farm for she and Wade, the pregnant partner, the chronically ill woman, each of those is a full identity costume built to meet what Taylor perceived that the people around her needed and wanted. And she maintained those costumes until the relationship required something that the current one could not provide. Maladaptive identity performance does not only show up in people who commit murders. It shows up in women who completely change their personality, opinions, interests, and friend groups every time they enter a new relationship. It shows up in wives who can't tell you their favorite restaurant because they've been ordering what their partner orders for so long they genuinely don't know. It shows up in people who cannot tell you what they actually want because they've been performing what other people want for so long. It also shows up in those who look back at a relationship and can't recognize who they were while they were in it. None of those things make someone Taylor Parker per se, but they all point at the same wound. And we're going to trace that wound back to where it started. Taylor's mother, Shauna Pryor, testified at her daughter's trial about she and Taylor's father's divorce, about the custody arrangement that devolved into fights in front of their children, about Taylor's childhood, and about the fake pregnancy. When asked why she didn't confront Taylor after knowing for months that her daughter was wearing a silicone belly and lying to a man about carrying his child, Shauna said, "Not much you can do about her fake pregnancy. She knew she wasn't pregnant. We knew she wasn't pregnant. There was no need to come up with a plan. We figured the lie would be exposed. He would figure it out." I want to stay here for a moment because that statement is the origin map, which is a framework I developed that traces a behavior, or in this case, a crime, back to the conditions that produced it. That is 1 in 3 sentences. A mother who knew her daughter was constructing an elaborate lie to keep a man decided there was nothing she could do. She watched, she waited, she figured it would fall apart on its own. And that's exactly what Taylor had been taught her whole life, that her crises were not worth interrupting, that her unraveling was not worth intervening in, that the adults around her would watch and wait and figure it would work itself out. That is what clinicians call maternal emotional unavailability, and I want to be precise about what that means because it clinically differs from a bad mother or an absent mother. Shauna was present. She testified at trial. She has custody of Taylor's daughter, Emerson. She was there. But being physically present is not the same as being emotionally available. Emotional availability means the mother is attuned, that she can see her daughter clearly, respond to what she actually sees, and make the child feel known. Not just housed, not just fed, but known. Shauna Pryor could not do that for Taylor. Neither could her father. Taylor had two parents, both unavailable in different ways, and both contributing to the same foundational void. And here is the intergenerational transfer of relational dysfunction. When a child grows up with a mother who is emotionally unavailable, who degrades rather than reflects, who watches rather than intervenes, who is present in the room but absent in the relationship, that's a BPD origin story in the making. A child who never developed a stable internal anchor has the ingredients to become an adult who spends the rest of her life trying to construct one to impress whoever is currently in the room. Now, I want to ask this question I always ask. What created Shauna? What was her own formation? What did her mother give her or fail to give her about how to see her daughter clearly? Origin mapping tells us that Shauna did not arrive at the level of detachment required to passively watch her daughter fake a pregnancy randomly. That level of detachment has a history, and that history is sitting somewhere in the generation before her, unnamed and still running. The cycle didn't start with Taylor, it moved through Shauna first. In 2015, Taylor Parker had a medically necessary hysterectomy. As with all hysterectomies, she no longer had a uterus and after the procedure could not carry a child. She already had 2 children from her first marriage, but the capacity to become pregnant again, to offer that to a new partner, to use that as a part of the performance of who she could be for that person, was gone. Her first husband testified that she was extremely upset about the surgery. For someone with identity disturbance whose entire relational architecture is built around becoming whatever the other person needs, fertility is not just a biological function, it's a relational tool. When the ability to bear life, which she viewed as something that would make her enough, was taken from her, maladaptive identity performance had to fill the gap that reality left. By the time Taylor met Wade, the full clinical picture was in place. Identity disturbance, emotional dysregulation, compulsive deception as a relational tool, maladaptive identity performance, a documented history of fabricating whatever was needed to prevent abandonment, and a biological reality, the hysterectomy, that she could not fabricate her way around forever. When the pregnancy lie started and Wade stayed, that confirmation was the breaking point, because now she knew that that specific fabrication worked. And she had 10 months to figure out what to do when his clock ran out. So on the morning of October 9th, 2020, Taylor Parker drove to Reagan Simmons-Hancock's home in New Boston, Texas. Reagan was 21 years old, almost 8 months pregnant, and her 3-year-old daughter, Kingsley, was in the house. It's documented that a few weeks before the murders I'm about to tell you about, she sat outside an OBGYN office and wrote down the license plate numbers of women leaving that appeared to be near term in their pregnancy. She was hunting pregnant women, and unfortunately, Reagan was the one she chose. What happened inside that home was documented at trial through forensic evidence and Taylor's own partial account to investigators. Reagan was strangled, beaten, and stabbed repeatedly. The medical examiner testified that a C-section was performed while Reagan was still alive, and her throat was slashed to make certain she was dead. Taylor then drove away with the baby, Braxlynn Sage, in her lap. She was pulled over by a Texas state trooper near the Oklahoma border, covered in blood, claiming she had just given birth on the side of the road. The baby was unresponsive and was pronounced dead at a hospital shortly after. Kingsley, Reagan's 3-year-old, was found alone in the house, hiding under a blanket, repeating, "Where's my mommy? Where's my mommy?" A forensic psychologist who reviewed the full case record testified that he saw no evidence of mental deterioration in Taylor's behavior leading up to the crime. He saw planning, calculation, a scheme that had been developing for months, and no remorse afterwards. That last detail, no remorse, is clinically significant, and I want to name it precisely. The absence of remorse in the aftermath is consistent with the emotional dysregulation and identity disturbance picture. When the self is organized entirely around its own survival, When the primary operating system is, I must not be abandoned, I must not lose the relationship, I must maintain the performance, the harm caused to another person does not register with the weight it should. Because the system that produces empathy, which is the capacity to feel what another person feels, to have their pain land inside of you, that system doesn't fully develop when the childhood environment was organized around surviving your own emotional reality rather than extending beyond it. When the state trooper pulled Taylor over, covered in blood, a dying baby in her lap, she told him she'd just given birth on the side of the road. Those were not just words, that was compulsive deception activating before rational thought could intervene. Even in that moment, even with everything collapsing around her, the only tool she had was another performance, because it was the only tool she had ever had. I want to come back to Shauna Pryor one more time, because there is a specific clinical thread here that I can't move past without naming it directly. Shauna admitted that she knew her daughter was faking a pregnancy for months. She watched Taylor post gender reveal content on social media. She watched her wear a silicone belly. She watched her construct an entire false reality around a pregnancy that did not exist. And she said nothing to Taylor, to Wade, to anyone. She also testified that about a month before the murder, she found out that Taylor had been reaching out to people trying to hire someone to kill her. Yeah, her own mother. While Shauna didn't directly cause Reagan's death, the pattern of maternal emotional unavailability, the watching, the waiting, the deciding that there's nothing to be done, was not a new response to a new crisis. It was the same response Taylor had been receiving her entire life. And it had been teaching Taylor one thing consistently for decades. You're on your own with whatever you're managing, so figure it out. A child who receives that message does not stop needing help. She stops asking for it. She stops presenting the real version of herself that needs it. She constructs a version that doesn't appear to need anything. And she maintains that construction because the cost of it, however high, has always felt safer than the cost of being seen clearly and still not being helped. That is the intergenerational transfer of relational dysfunction. That is mother-daughter trauma operating across different decades. And that is what was running in Taylor Parker on October 9th, 2020. Reagan Simmons-Hancock paid the cost of a pattern that started long before she ever met Taylor. So let me put it all together, because this is the work. A child grows up in a home where her parents nastily divorce, where her mother is present but emotionally unavailable, degrading, volatile, watching from a distance and deciding that there's nothing to do, where the authentic version of herself, the struggling, desperate, needy version, is consistently met with distance, dismissal, or degradation. That environment does not produce a secure attachment. It produces the clinical conditions for borderline personality disorder, identity disturbance, emotional dysregulation, a self that is not anchored, a relational system organized entirely around preventing abandonment, because abandonment, emotional if not always physical, is the defining experience of childhood. And that identity disturbance installs a specific belief that does not announce itself as a belief. It operates like a fact. And that belief is, I am not enough as I actually am. The only version of me that is safe to present is the version that keeps who I'm obsessed with here. So I'll become that. Whatever it requires, however elaborate the plan to maintain it, however far from reality I need to go. Compulsive deception as a relational tool kicks in early. Maladaptive identity performance becomes the primary survival strategy. And when that child, who's now an adult woman's uterus, is removed in 2015, when the one biological reality she has been able to offer without fabricating is taken, her lies scale to fill that gap. A silicone belly, forged ultrasounds, months of gender reveal posts, and when the due date approached and there was no baby coming, the lie required a real baby, which Reagan Simmons-Hancock had. That is the cycle. BPD rooted in maternal emotional unavailability, identity disturbance as the core wound, compulsive deception and maladaptive identity performance as the survival strategy, emotional dysregulation as the accelerant, and a mother who watched her daughter disappear into the lie and said there was nothing she could do because her daughter was never really one to tell the truth. That cycle did not start with Taylor. It moved through Shauna first. And based on what we know about intergenerational trauma, through whoever shaped Shauna before that. Reagan was 21 years old. Braxlynn never took a breath outside her mother's body. And their deaths deserve to mean something. This is what they mean. New episodes of Cycles That Kill drop every week. If this episode hit you somewhere real, share it, leave a review on Apple, and come back next week. I'm Dr. Dylesia. This is Cycles That Kill. See you next time.